Well, hello, Susan.
Hello, how are you, Neil?
I'm fine, and you?
Good.
It is so nice to see you
Well,
after some time.
yeah, it's great to be together again.
Just so that our viewers know, when we were both pulling into the Supreme Court, I did what I did for a good bit of my career, and that is follow you to,
Oh,
to your parking spot and parked right behind you. So thank you for being a pioneer, even as we drive into the Supreme Court.
well, I was happy to do it. I thought it was a security detail when I looked in my rearview mirror.
Well, Susan, as we prepare for this, I've been giving some thought to how to get it started. And first of all, I want to tell you that you have an amazing resume. If there was an Olympic event for resumes, you'd be definitely on the U.S. team. You've been a pioneer. You've been an advisor to governors, senators, judges. You've been an inspiration to young lawyers. You've made a tremendous impact on the bar in your time as a lawyer. And it's almost hard to pick a place to start with you because you've done so much. So I thought if anybody wanted to see just the first 5 minutes of this video, that I'd ask you the two things that I really am most interested to hear about from you. And the first is, what advice would you give to young lawyers, male and female, as they begin their career? And secondly, what impact do you think your 45, 46-year career has had in terms of the New Hampshire bar?
Well, those are hard questions to answer in a lot of ways. I guess in terms of advice to young lawyers, I think the simplest advice that I would give is for people to fit the profession into their lives rather than their lives into the profession. A legal career is a long career for most of us, and I think eventually most lawyers do learn to fit their profession into their life. But I think starting out, it's very easy to have the practice of law be all-consuming, and I think that doesn't make for a well-rounded person. The person who really excels in the practice of law is a person who is a good lawyer, but also is good in terms of being able to understand the community, understand the context in which they're practicing, and to have a decent life with their family and in their community.
Well, no one that I know of has so successfully integrated your practice with your community involvement. You've been on boards, you've led volunteer groups, you've been involved with the courts. What satisfactions have you derived from all of that community service?
I think the first person that ever gave me the glimmer of combining community service and the practice of law was our former partner, Malcolm McLean. And he came to me after I'd been at Orr and Reno for a few months, and he said, you know, in this firm, we all contribute to the community, and we get back from the community by being part of the community. And by the way, we need to have a loaned executive over at the United Way, and we'd like you to take that on. And I did, and you know, one of the great satisfactions was seeing the interplay between participating in the community, practicing law, contributing to the community, developing a client base, being able to have a career that's varied, because you're not just locked into one narrow aspect of the practice of law.
The other question is your impact. You were a pioneer, Susan, and we'll get into that a little bit later and in more detail. But you've been a leader. You were a woman lawyer when there were very few in the bar. do you think your career has had an impact on the bar and the role of women lawyers that they now have in terms of their numbers and influence over the bar?
You know, it's very hard for me to judge that. I'm still practicing law. I'm very proud of the fact that as a bar we have moved from what this picture here shows, which is the only prop I brought for this, which is the picture of my bar class, which you're in this picture too, but this is 81 lawyers, and there's one woman, and that's me. And when I started out, you know, I didn't know really what would be expected of me. People were still calling me brother and Esquire. Of course, they still call people Esquire. And it was a unique experience, but satisfying in many ways. And I hope that I have contributed to the fact that we now have essentially, you know, a bar that is gender neutral in the sense of people want the best lawyer, not the best male lawyer, which wasn't the case when I started practicing. And I hope I've contributed to that. The other thing that I'm happy that I did, and I think this has contributed to a body of law that we now have, is having chaired the group of many, many lawyers who worked to adopt the New Hampshire Uniform Trust Code, now called the New Hampshire Trust Code. And I'm not proud of it because of my knowledge of trust law, but I'm really happy that I was able to lead a very, very large group of lawyers into studying this code, we were the first state to adopt it in the nation, and to being able to help people move forward, exchange ideas, and come to resolution where people didn't always agree on what the code should be. It was a unique experience, and I think the code has had a good run now for a good number of years and is proving to be very helpful in the practice of trust law. So I'm very proud of that.
Well, you have a lot to be proud of, and this picture that you brought is just stunning to me. I'm in the back row, frowning, I don't know why, and you are there, the only woman out of 81 lawyers. And I recall when I found out in our firm that you were being hired. I had seniority of you for all of 10 months. And when you joined the firm, you fit in seamlessly. I don't remember in our firm any issues of gender differential. Now, maybe I was blind to it, Susan, but did you experience anything in your early days, at least at our firm?
Not at Orr & Reno, I did not. And it was very interesting. I mean, you and Leo Lind and I, we were the three associates at that point in time. I think everybody else was a partner. I'm not sure about Dick Hauser.
Dick had just been made a partner.
That's right.
Just before you came.
Yes.
After a year of my being an associate.
So it was the three of us, and we did the usual things that young associates do, you know, talk about ascending and how are we going to be able to, and are we going to make it, and getting our hours in. And we played tennis, you know, after work. I remember the three of us used to go and play tennis together, and, you know, we had, I mean, I think I fit in very well. I didn't try to fit in, it just was a natural thing. I will say that I remember at one point in time, Dudley Orr wanted me to be involved representing somebody in some minor case, and the client said, he hadn't met me yet, but he said to Mr. Orr that he would prefer to have a male lawyer. And Mr. Orr told him that, you know, the way the firm worked was that Dudley decided who was appropriate to represent which person, and that I was the person that was most appropriate to represent him, and that's the way they did it. And you know, within the firm, there was absolutely no gender discrimination.
Yeah, it was a total seamless fit, as
Yeah.
I remember. I never remember even thinking about it. I do remember being quite impressed that you were clerk for the New Hampshire Supreme Court, in part because my law school dean, I went to Vanderbilt, was an admirer, a great admirer of Chief Justice Frank Kennison, and would always point out his decisions in the classes that I took from the dean. And when he found out that I was going to New Hampshire to practice, he was really quite taken aback that I would have the privilege of practicing law in a state with such an august Supreme Court. So when you came to the firm as a clerk from that court, and they didn't hire a whole lot of clerks, as I remember, I thought that you had been trained and ready to go to take up the flame of the Frank Kennison, the power of analysis.
Well, it didn't quite happen that way, but and I was also very fond and very much admired Frank Kennison, and so did my fellow law clerk. There were 2 law clerks that year. It was the first year up here that there were 2 law clerks, and Derek Weston, who was from, he had practiced law for a year, I think, at California Rural Legal Assistance, working with Cesar Chavez, and then had wanted to come. He had graduated from Bolt Hall and wanted to come to New Hampshire because he wanted to be a law clerk in Frank Kennison's court. And he had studied with Professor Ehrensweig, who was a great conflicts of law scholar and professor, and wanted to expose himself to some conflicts of law issues in New Hampshire. Unfortunately, Judge Kennison was ill for the first part of our clerkship, so I think he left New Hampshire without ever having the pleasure of working on a conflicts of law decision.
Wasn't there a
Judge
famous
Kennison.
case that Frank?
There was, and it was involved in an automobile. I can't remember the name of it.
It was Clark was in the name.
Yeah, and it was involved in an automobile accident where the resident was from Vermont and the accident was in New Hampshire or something like that.
What I remember is that it was a 4 or 4.5 page decision that was brilliantly cogent, and you no doubt had a great deal of benefit from working with that court for a year.
Yeah, I mean, Frank Kennison, to my mind, was a perfect example of a person who fit his profession into his life. I mean, he had a real life in the community. He really didn't want to come up here to this beautiful building that had just opened the year that I came here. He really liked being a judge downtown where he could go out and have lunch with people, and I mean he did truly fit his profession into his community life and his personal life in a remarkable way.
So we know how you fit your professional career into your life, but let's talk a little bit more about your life, particularly your early life. Could you tell us about your upbringing, your family, and how they influenced you in terms of your career and your career choice?
Sure. I was born in North Carolina. My dad was in the Navy at the time, and he was stationed at Cherry Point. We lived on an island right near Cape Hatteras, and then moved to Tennessee. My dad was a professor at what was then the Peabody Teachers College, I think, which is now part of Vanderbilt.
I didn't know
your
that.
alma mater, yeah. And lived there for a few years, and then in Kentucky. My dad was a professor at the University of Kentucky. And then he got a sabbatical leave and a Fulbright scholarship to go to Austria to study. Music was his field. And so he brought the whole family. We didn't have a lot of money, but he had both, a half pay from his sabbatical leave, and he had this Fulbright. And we all went over. My parents enrolled us in the Austrian schools, and they all spoke nothing but German. We all learned German and had a fabulous time, traveled all over Europe on the many vacations they give people over there compared to here, and came back. And eventually, I had 3 sisters and eventually 1 brother. We ended up moving to New Mexico for a while, and then came back my senior year in high school. I actually had to leave the school that I loved to move to outside of Boston, to Needham, and I graduated from Needham High School in 1962 and went on to Mount Holyoke College. And my dad had always said, you girls all need to have professions. You need to be on your own. You need to not be dependent on who you marry or who you don't marry. I hope you'll all, he didn't push us anywhere, but he said, I'd love to have a lawyer, I'd love to have a doctor, I'd love to have a teacher. I can't remember what the laundry list was, but anyway, so when I graduated from college, I worked for a year for the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, D.C., and then I enrolled in law school. And I think I really owe the fact that I even considered going to law school to the good influence of my parents, and especially my father.
So he sounds to me like a feminist of his time.
He was, yeah. I mean, he really, he wanted his gals to be independent and self-sufficient at whatever they did.
So you applied to law school and went to law school. And what was the breakdown between men and women in your law school class? My
class was huge. It was so big they had to break it out into 3 sections, and I can't remember how many hundred people that were. I think it was probably over 300 people in my class. I can't remember for sure now. It was the largest class they'd ever had at Boston University, and they were in a brand new building, and it was all very exciting. There were 5 women in my class.
Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe 300 students total?
At least 300.
Were you friendly with the other 4 women? Did you bond together, or was that not?
I was friendly with them, but I bonded more with the people in my section, of which there were, I think, there was one other woman. I can't remember for sure how it broke down now, but I know there was one other woman in my section. I had gone to an all-girls college, and so, I thought, I wonder what it's going to be like to be essentially in an all-male law school. And to be honest with you, I didn't notice any difference. I mean,
really?
No. I mean, I made a lot of good friends in law school, and it was much like coming to Orem Reno. It was sort of seamless, even though that was a time when there were not a lot of women applying to law school or getting into law school. And we were treated just like everybody else. So.
Were you aware at that time, this is in the late 60s?
Yes, it was 1967 to 70, yeah.
Were you aware of any stories or vignettes you heard about women being discouraged from going to law school?
No, I wasn't. I think it just wasn't a field at that time that women either thought of going into or went into. And I do remember hearing stories I remember hearing one story about a woman who would have graduated from Harvard Law School considerably before me, a woman named Diane Lund. She married a lawyer in Boston named Eric Lund, but when she was in law school at Harvard, she was very bright. And the professor who wrote the book on contracts law, I can't remember his name right now, but anyway, he asked her a very complicated question, and he kind of picked on her a little bit, she felt, and everybody else felt too. And he asked her this incredibly complicated question, and she said, well, I think, Professor, that what you're trying to ask me is such and such and so and so. She was so bright, and he was, to his credit, said, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But I think there was a little bit of that. My dad was a dean at Boston University not in the law school. He was in the School of Fine Arts, and I could remember it was called School of Fine and Applied Arts, and our property professor my first year used to call it the School of Sex for All Ages, and and he would pick on when he called on me, and so he did pick on me a little bit in that way, but it was it's all good natured, and
yeah.
And right after within a couple years of my graduation, there was a flood of people applying to law school.
Well, now why did that happen? Was the movement all of a sudden getting momentum?
I honestly don't know. I do know that most of the women who graduated in my class went into work for the government. It was not easy to get a job in a private firm. And I don't know what the order of change was, but there was a considerable shift you know, I can remember within 5 years of me graduating from law school, there were 10 or 20%, I can't remember the numbers exactly now, of the graduates were women. And they were getting jobs, you know, just like anybody else.
In these early years, I don't have. Did you have a sense that you were a leader in this particular area, women in law?
No, I didn't. I didn't. It sounds surprising to me when I give that answer, but I just saw myself as a person who was going to be a lawyer when I got out of law school.
Yeah, I think that's the way I saw you. I saw you as a good lawyer, and it didn't occur to me that there was anything else to put into the calculus. You were good, and you were helpful and thoughtful and smart.
The one thing I think I would have done differently if I went to law school again is I in the summers when I was not in law school, after my first year and after my second year, I went back to the Bureau of Labor Statistics for my summer job. They hired me back for the summer, and it was far more lucrative than anything I could have done, and I needed the money, so I did go back and do that. And so after I graduated and I was ready to practice law, I was really glad I had the clerkship to sort of warm up a little bit, because I had never been in a law firm. Never. So it was very, very interesting to go into the practice of law without ever having practiced a little bit on it.
I can relate to that. Did you have this experience or a similar one? I can recall being at our firm, and it was the first month, and I was sitting in the library because that was the associate's first office before they trusted the associate to have a real office. And Bob Reno came flying through the library and said, "I have a project for you. Here's this transaction. I want you to write the deed for it." And I said, "Fine, I'm on it." And then he left the room, and I thought to myself, I knew what a deed was, but I had no idea what it looked like.
Yeah.
Did you have that beginning
Yes.
experience?
Yes. And I can still remember, I mean, back when we started practicing law, I think you did too, I think we all did, we spent a lot of times in the Registry of Deeds. There were no such things as paralegals. There was no such thing as title insurance. And we did a lot of real estate transactions at Orono for people buying houses and buying businesses and all that. And we would have to go down to the registry and spend days on end searching the grantor index and the grantee index and looking at all the old deeds and really, you know, learning by the seat of your pants, so to speak.
Yeah, it was. I had that experience too, and I rather liked it. I remember going to the Registry of Deeds on a complicated search and be in there for days and days. And there got to be a club environment of the people there at the same time. I remember, do you remember Dave Tardif?
Yes. Yes.
So Dave was a little standoffish at the beginning, but if he saw you struggling, he would help.
Come over and give you a
Yeah.
little bit of
Yeah.
guidance.
Yeah. You know, you might want to look at the grantee first, and but it was totally different. What are some of the biggest differences beyond lawyers in the Registry of Deeds that you now experience when you think back to those times?
I spent a lot of time in the registry, and I also spent a lot of time truing up the accountings that Mr. Orr and Mr. Reno submitted to the probate court for their many trusts and estates that they were managing. And everything, we did have a little calculator that looked like it was from the early 1900s, but everything was done by hand. And I can remember being a penny off or 2 pennies off and struggling for hours to find, you know, where is that penny? Where is the dime? Why am I off $10 with these accountings? I did a lot of those. And actually, many of them had been done previously by Mr. Orr's secretary, Irene Marden. who actually knew a lot more about the law than I did. And maybe than you did too, I don't know.
Definitely.
But they really, the secretaries had been there for a long, long time. They were very sharp and they knew a ton. And it was very important to be on very good terms with them so that they could help you out as you were learning the ropes. So accountings was one thing I remember doing a lot of, endless memos of law. And I remember doing one for Charlie Toll one time, doing a memo of law on, it had to do with the foreclosure of a mortgage. And I missed a case. And he never came and said anything to me about missing the case. But when I came into work after a weekend, there's this case, a copy of this case sitting, the book's open and the case is right there. What is this? It was the case that I had missed, and it was an important case. So I did do a lot of legal research. I can remember going out with Mr. Orr on field trips. We would go out and take a look at properties with his various clients.
He drove me by, we were in Newport, and he drove me by an old church in Newport, and we stopped and got out of the car so he could explain the spire to me, because that church had a particularly handsome spire belfry. And I wish I could remember what he told me about it, but he was quite taken with it.
Yeah.
That was one of his road trips.
Well, those were all really good experiences and things that you don't experience by and large today. You know, there's so much of the practice of law is done, you know, in the office and in the courtroom. And it really shapes you in a way that it's hard to appreciate until you are looking back on it, I think.
I know you, like I, had several mentors at Orr and Reno, and we're still in our early days there in the early 70s. Does any one lawyer particularly stand out to you as being especially influential in your practice?
I would say that Mr. Orr is the one that really stood out to me. He spent a lot of time with me, you know, so I went around with him to a lot of things. I worked with him. I remember he got assigned a pro bono case. We all had to take these pro bono cases, and his was, I can't remember what kind of case it was, but it was in the district court with Judge Mattson. And I remember when Dudley walked in, I was carrying his bag and had done the memos and all that in his little district court case. And I remember walking in, and even Judge Mattson stood up when he saw Mr. Orr coming along. But I think Mr. Orr was, to me, I think to other lawyers at Orr and Reno, he was more of a mentor in terms of his facility with the law. For me, he was a mentor in terms of the way he lived his life and practiced law. You know, he lived his life devoting huge amounts of time to the community. He had a wonderful home life, many, many friends, and he was a sought-after lawyer. I mean, what more can you ask for? And I always admired him for the way he lived his life.
Well, it seems to me that you're now in that same spot.
Oh, I don't think of myself in that same spot at all. But tell me, who was your mentor?
You have, I think it was Dudley, but we'll talk about Charlie Toll, who was a real teacher to me, just like the experience you had with him. He would be patient and explain things to me very carefully and deliberately, and in ways that I could understand it. Mm-hmm. And he was, remember his little handwriting?
Oh, yes, and he was such a big man.
He's an All-American football player at Princeton, and he had this very small script. And Diane Laverdier, I worked with for years and is a friend of mine, I asked her, how is it that you can interpret that? Because that was her principal skill.
She was his secretary.
Yeah, and she could turn his handwriting into typewritten text. And she said, it's all there. You just have to look for it. And in a lot of ways, that was the lesson that he taught me in law.
Yeah.
It's all there. You just have to look for it, whether it's the facts or the law. You just have to be patient and look for it.
Yeah.
Do you remember the technology back then, Susan?
I remember we still had a mimeograph machine, and I think the typewriters were just, and we had carbon paper.
Carbon paper. Whiteout.
And whiteout, yes, I do remember that. And I remember, and the file copies were always the carbon copy, and you could see where if they'd use whiteout, you could always tell. And I'm trying to think what else they had. I mean, we didn't use, there were no calculators. It was, everything was a lot simpler in a lot of ways.
I recall the days then in the early 70s of communicating by U.S. mail, and it was elegant.
Yes.
You'd get a letter and you'd think about it, maybe a day or two, and then you'd write a draft back and change the draft and then send it out, and the other lawyer recipient would receive it and think about it, and the pace was very was deliberate.
Yes.
Do you miss those days?
I mean, I liked those days. I guess I haven't taken the time to think about, do I miss them? In a way, I do, yeah, I think so.
In preparing for this interview, I thought about the day that a computer first showed up on my desk, and we were practicing together at the time. It was 1994, and we were partners at our firm, and Dennis, our IT guy at the time, came by and he put this huge thing on my desk. And he said, Neil, this is how you're going to practice from now on. And I looked at it and said, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Give me the phone and my pink slips and let me dictate my letters. So we, Susan, have practiced half our careers without a computer. Yeah. And I wonder if the current generation can even conceive of how you can practice without a computer.
I don't think they could. Or do legal research, without looking at the whole case, just, zoning in on your computer to the part of the case that you're interested in.
How do you best use technology now in your practice?
I don't use it for legal research. When I do legal research, I still do some of my own legal research.
Really?
Because I think sometimes, I remember taking some tax law courses, and I remember them saying, you can't just jump into the Internal Revenue Code. You have to understand, for example, what's income? Well, is it realized income you're talking about? Is it recognized income? Is it taxable income? You can't just jump into the code and take a section and understand it if you don't understand the context in which something is said. And
you're a true lawyer. You know that, Susan? Still doing your own research?
I don't do all my own research, obviously, but some of it I do, yeah.
Is it the intellectual thrill of solving problems?
Yes, and just I like to see the evolution of thinking over time too, which you do see when you research case law. And the law does change ever so slowly sometimes.
So we were talking about this on our walk in. I've noticed that in my field, health law, the law has changed dramatically since 2008. Just simply dramatically, and it's an entirely new focus with health insurance reform. And the changes aren't always welcome to me. They seem to be, all decisions are based on regulations that are 1,000 pages long. And I don't have the patience to read 1,000 pages. I don't have the patience to read 10 pages. So do you think that the changes in your legal environment in which you live, do you think they are good or bad?
I think some of them are good, but I think the idea of the zillion pages of regulation that's in healthcare law or education law. I mean, I'm working on some projects now involving trying to improve civics education in New Hampshire, And so much is controlled, so much of education, our kids' education, is controlled by the federal government. You know, they talk about local control, but really, so much of it is influenced by federal law that it's incredible. I don't think that's good. On the other hand, you know, I think New Hampshire was ready for a trust code when that was adopted a few years ago, and I think we had always relied on case law basically to determine, for the most part, what the rules and regs were governing the administration of trusts. And I think that law has been very helpful. And you know, there aren't regs that go with it or anything like that, and it means what it says. And so, in that sense, I think it's really good. But you know, it's here. You know, I think the regulation and complication. Look at the federal tax code. Look at health care law. Look at education law. I mean, they are, you know, solution of problems that aren't always solving the problems that they're trying to address, and that's unfortunate.
We definitely have to deal with what's happening now.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Robin Williams, who said, "Reality, what a concept." What about, Susan, in your career, some memorable personalities that you've encountered in the legal arena? Do any particular people stand out to you as being particularly memorable, as even maybe flamboyant or inspirational?
There are any number of people, including some flamboyant ones, I mean, that stand out. And I'm not talking necessarily about lawyers, although there are some that really do stand out. One of the lawyers that stands out in my mind is Stanley Brown.
I was thinking of Stanley. Tell me why.
Well,
Yes.
I just remember him as everybody said what a bear he was, how difficult he was, and obviously highly intelligent, and you know, you don't ever want to be against him. And I found him to be immensely equitable and fair and kind. And yes, if you know, he could get his dander up, but I found him to be a wonderful person to work with and to work again on the other side of. He really stands out in my mind.
He was a pioneer
Yeah.
in his own way. And I recall in one of the few trials that I actually attended from start to finish, I was carrying Ron Snow's bag. We had the verdict come in. We were in plaintiffs, as was Stanley Brown. And the verdict came in, and I remember Stanley turning to one of the defense lawyers. There were several defendants, and they had joint and several liability. And he looked at one and said, "Listen, if you appeal this decision, I'm going to collect the entire judgment from your client." And this defense lawyer dissolved.
Yes, okay.
And
the practical way.
That put a new element into his appeal planning.
Yes,
For
yes,
sure.
Yeah.
Were there others?
Well, you know, one of the really remarkable people, I think, in the Concord area was Malcolm McLean, who basically had he was kind of the grandfather of probate and trust law and all that, but he was also, he was on the board of aldermen of Concord back when Concord was run in that manner. But I don't know if he was mayor of Concord.
Yes,
he was mayor too, yeah. And it wasn't his personality so much, it's just that he had his hand in everything. But then so did a lot of people, the lawyers in the Concord area. I mean, you know, they ran the gas company, they ran the electric company. You know, Dudley Orr was chairman of the board of Dartmouth College, chairman of the board of, was he chairman of the board of Philip Exeter, or was it Charlie Toll, or was it both of them at different times? I can't
think
remember.
they were both on the board.
But they were just remarkable people in the things that they did, and they were all over the place. And they were all admirable in the way they lived and in the way they practiced law and the way they contributed to their community.
You know, it just occurred to me, Susan, you might not know, but you have a role to play in the advent of coeducation at Dartmouth College.
I do?
You do. And
I didn't know that.
yes, you do. And it all clicked. I was driving around as a 2-year associate with Mr. Orr, and we were going to see a client, and he, at the time, was chair of the college's Committee on Coeducation. And so we were talking, and he said, was talking about you and your contributions to the firm and how valuable you were. And he was talking about his 2 daughters. He had no sons, he had 2 daughters, and how he had wished that they had gone to Dartmouth. And so he asked me, Neil, what do you think about coeducation at Dartmouth? And I was all for it. I mean, going to an all-male school was a weird environment, particularly one as rural as Dartmouth. So ultimately, he recommended coeducation to the other trustees, and it was passed, not without some dissenting votes, but it was passed, and I think you had an influence in that, now that I piece all the information together.
Well, I know that Judge Kennison what actually brought Dudley Orr to task, in a sense. When I was clerking here, I was applying to various law firms for jobs, and I wasn't being terribly successful. One of the larger firms had offered me a job, but it was essentially doing exclusively real estate work, and I said, well, I really want to be in the general practice of law. And then I applied to another firm in Manchester, and my then husband, Dick Galway, was practicing at Divine Millimet, and they offered me a job, or as much as offered me a job, and then like within a couple of days called me back and said, we just learned that you're engaged to Richard Galway, and he's going to be at Divine Millimet, and we can't have 2 lawyers in the same town, you know, in these different firms. How would we deal with confidentiality and all that? And so they sort of revoked their interest in me, and so I was struggling, and Judge Kennison knew about it, and unbeknownst to me, he called Dudley Orr and said, you should interview this young woman. You should offer her a job. You should put your money where your mouth is in terms of, you know, you being chairman of the board and advocating for women to enter Dartmouth College. You should have a woman enter your law firm. And that's how I got the interview at Orr & Reno.
Wow. Can you even imagine that kind of story being told today?
I know.
Or do you think it happens maybe sometimes? Do you think discrimination against women lawyers?
I don't think so. I think because clients want the best lawyer, and clients really don't care anymore whether their lawyer is male or female. I think we've surpassed that hurdle. Where we haven't in this bar is in terms of pay equality. The bar puts out the statistics on pay, and women still make less than men, and whether that's due to more years of men being in the bar or not, I don't know, but that is still a factor.
I've noticed that number, and I've not thought about it a lot. Are there people who are drilling down into the underlying data? I could imagine it's a matter of seniority differences, but I can also imagine that there is some residual reluctance for equal pay.
I don't know what they're doing. I haven't really followed that closely, but I imagine that they probably are trying to drill down to address the issue.
I haven't encountered it in the firms that I've been involved
No,
with.
Nor me, but one of our former colleagues, Gail Braley from Orr & Reno, came over to work at McLean, and I know she, by choice, she did not want to be a partner at McLean. She did not want to, work an excessive amount of time. Her husband is also a lawyer, and she wanted to be able to, devote a limited amount of time and a limited amount of responsibility for client work. So there's a case, and I don't know that anybody has drilled down, but there's a case where she set her own limit on what she wanted.
Yeah. As you think back on your career, Susan, can you share with us some of your favorite experiences, your most gratifying wins or negotiations or relationships? What really fuels the excitement and enthusiasm that you have for the law?
I think one of the most fun times I had practicing law was in the 90s, and I started out very simply writing a title insurance policy for a Boston law firm. They had clients, Japanese clients, who were going to be taking over the old Hawthorne College in Antrim, New Hampshire. And so they wanted to have the title work done on that, because that college had gone down in flames. So I did that. Well, it turned out the CEO of the company, this company, Maruzen Kensetsu is the name of it, it's a Tokyo-based company, had never been in the U.S. before. They wanted to buy this campus in Antrim, New Hampshire, because they envisioned having a college that would have an East component and a West component. There would be Japanese students and English-speaking students studying along the lines of the Great Books College of St. John's, where they start the 5th century BC and the 4th century, and they do, the math and the history and the literature of each century. They want to do that in 2 languages. And the reason they were interested in doing that was because Japan plans very carefully for its student population, and they only build enough colleges to accommodate the existing demand, and they were going to have this huge demand. So these people saw, an option to come over here and do their own thing and bring students over. And they wanted to have an aviation component. They bought an old airfield in Deering, New Hampshire, and then they were going to have this campus. And so what happened was their CEO, who spoke Japanese and English and who died suddenly, and they didn't have anybody that could run this project. And it was a construction project, and it involved getting college certification. It involved buying a place in Boston so they could bring their fancy Japanese families over to interview in a prominent place in Boston. Anyway, I ended up effectively being the CEO, and it was just loads and loads of fun. And we got everything. We had the dorm almost finished, and we had they had a basketball court that had been all renovated, and they had a classroom ready to go. And then the bubble burst in Japan, and there was some question about whether the money that left Japan actually made it to New Hampshire. And so the project ended up dissolving, and the property got sold, and that was the end of it. But it was a really exciting, fun time. And I enjoyed myself tremendously doing that work. And it sort of combined all the different things I had learned in the practice of law over the years. So that was loads of fun. The other thing that was really rewarding was creating the trust department at Orr & Reno. And it almost became like a company within a company. We had the work divided a lot differently than you normally do in a law firm. We had the law firm become a registered investment advisor with the SEC, and it was, again, a very rewarding experience.
It was a marvel.
Yeah.
All the money that was being managed and the closeness of the relationship between the lawyers and the clients, it was a marvel.
Yeah. It was really nice, and there was no competition for clients because we had it all worked out. We represented everybody that was in that firm. There were 4 women attorneys, all part-time, all with young children, all went on to have very, very successful careers. We had my husband Chuck, me, and we had Chuck Zipzak. I don't know if he was there when you were there, but he
Yeah.
went on to teach law school at UNC. And we operated it. Everybody had roles to play, and the clients belonged to all of us. It wasn't my client or your client. It was the firm's client.
Very advanced.
It was really
very advanced.
fun. It was a lot of fun.
Well, Susan, we need to finish up in the next few minutes, and I'm wondering what I've forgotten to ask you that you think is part of your legacy that you want to record for purposes of the future. I mean, you've done so much. You've been involved in so many different things, and you've been a leader and a pioneer, as I've said 3 times now. Is there anything else that you want to put on the record as part of who Susan Leahy is and was in her past years?
Well, I think the one thing I'd end with is having the opportunity to start up the New Hampshire Supreme Court Society, which I was invited to do with 4 other people. And it all started back, I can't remember the exact year, but it was probably 10 years ago or so. It was the occasion where they put the new portrait of Judge Kennison. Judge Broderick was raising money for that portrait, and he had some money left over. And after we did that event where we had Justice Souter speaking and governors, and we had a wonderful time, he had some money left over, and he said, I would really love it if you would think about establishing a society, something that would honor our Supreme Court. So we created the New Hampshire Supreme Court Society, and the Supreme Court Society got involved right up front with the idea of trying to improve civics education in New Hampshire. And we're now, Supreme Court Society, I'm just getting ready to go off the board. Sherry Young is very ably leading it as my successor, and we're creating another organization called the New Hampshire Institute for Civics Education, which is focused exclusively on improving K-12 civics education in the public schools. And that's a work in progress, and we'll see where we go with it. But I think we're going to go far with it. I think we're really going to do something in New Hampshire with that, and I'm really excited to be playing a role in it.
Terrific work.
Yeah.
Having taught in a high school, I know how the civics awareness needs to be enhanced.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about just maybe 1 or 2 final questions, and one of them, Susan, is like a postscript to this whole interview. It's in terms of regrets. I don't know for certain, but I suspect you've been asked to be a judge. Did you ever want to be a judge? Were you sorry that you're not a judge?
I'm not sorry that I'm not a judge. I was actually invited by 2 different governors of 2 different parties to put my hat in the ring and to be a Superior Court judge. And I thought long and hard about it because it would have been a tremendous honor to have done it. But I also thought about the sort of silo effect of that profession, that it is a little bit more isolating than I'm used to. When I found out, when I was invited the first time to be a Superior Court judge, my husband said, well, you know, I said, why don't you call and, you know, ask somebody who's sitting on the Superior Court what it's like. So I called Dave Souter. He was sitting on the Superior Court in Coos County, where all the new judges got assigned. And I said, no, I don't think I want to do that. So no, I don't regret it at all.
I think you would have made a terrific judge.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Of course, I think you're a terrific lawyer.
Well, thank you.
Well, Susan, this has been an absolutely wonderful trip down memory lane with you. And I want to thank you on behalf of the bar for the inspiration that you've been to lawyers over the past 46 years. You're a remarkable example for those in the bar.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and I'm not sure I deserve them all, but I appreciate them very much, and I appreciate so much your being willing to interview me for this.
So I guess I do have one last question.
Okay.
What's next?
I don't know. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing.
Well, you're so good at it. You should keep doing what you're doing.
I enjoy it. It changes all the time, but
Well,
thank you,
Susan.
Thank you.
Yeah.